But the milestones are important, right? That one of the major ones happened this week when a state representative actually filed the legislation that would give Texans the vote on it. Now, will it pass the legislature? Who knows? But the horse is out of the barn now. You know, the fact of the matter is that any politician in Austin that is seen as standing between the people and their ability to vote on this issue probably is not going to survive the next election cycle. So the horse is out of the barn. We are going to get a vote on this sooner rather than later.
We have a wonderful guest with us. Yes. I have the pleasure of introducing to you. I was going to say to you all, but I should say y'all, given that Hannah's from Georgia and Daniel's from Texas. And I'm from Connecticut through no fault of my own, but it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Daniel Miller. Dan is, of course, president of the Texas Nationalist Movement. He's been an outspoken advocate for Texas independence since 1996. You've seen him on Fox, you've seen him on CNN, CNBC, you've seen him on the BBC, Brexit, right? So I'm sure many of you are going to spend some time on his websites tonight. There'll be two that will be featuring the Texas Nationalist Movement site, as well as DanielOMiller.com. So you can read up even more on Daniel's very, very impressive accomplishments. So Daniel, thank you so much for being with us. You ready for this? You are our very first guest for the Insiders Club for our live Q&A. We got David Horowitz next week, but no, you're number one, my friend. You're first and foremost. Thanks for being with us, Daniel.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's cool to be on the bleeding edge.
Yeah. Well, I think you're used to that, aren't you?
Yeah, just a little bit. Just a little bit.
Well, let's start with some historical context here, just as we begin our discussion. And I told everyone I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to ask you questions first, and then I'll throw it out to the members here. But one of the things that I had fun in doing research for tonight and having you on here is I came across a video you were on with Glenn Beck when he was with Fox News. Okay, right. So what is this?
CNN headline news.
Oh, okay. There you go. Yeah. CNN head. So you've been this one. If I think it was I think it was from 2010 or 2012. Can't remember.
Yeah, but it was I think it was like 2009, 2010, somewhere around there.
There you go. You were both handsome young men. No, I think he's always had gray, but I don't think he had a shred of gray on you.
Not a bit, and actually no more of this either. So this is all just sort of, this has been that way for a very long time.
Yeah, we're all facing that. But it was so fascinating. I don't know if you remember, Daniel. He did not seem to take Texit very seriously back then. It was, I guess he was doing a bunch of episodes featuring secessionists. So the night before we had a far leftist from Vermont who wanted the second Vermont Republic. He wanted Vermont to secede. So he was featuring all these secessionist movements as if, well, I mean, it seemed to me as if, they were kind of like, almost like a circus sideshow or something like that. And he was certainly respectful to you, as you were to him, of course, but he was clearly mocking the idea. I want to play for our audience, just so everyone understands how far ahead of the curve Daniel has been. I just want to contrast that with a quick 17-second clip with what Glenn Beck had to say literally just days ago. Hannah, do you have that clip? This is too good.
Can y'all see my screen? We ready to go?
We can. Yep.
All right.
So if this were just a vote, I would vote for it. But if this were a vote, I think, I'd have to really listen to the whole argument. If this were like Brexit, I would vote for it because it doesn't mean war.
I would vote for it because it doesn't mean war. That was the thing. Glenn Beck has done a full 180. Well, he's done that a few times. Let's just be honest. But hey, welcome to the party, right? Glad to have you. Keep in mind now, Glenn is, I believe he's now a Texas resident. He's moved down to Texas.
That was the whole irony of it. You know, he brought me on, and you know, the gentleman that he had on the night before was Dr. Thomas Naylor, who, you know, he, I guess, probably comparatively speaking, would be somewhat, you know, left of where we are, but he was definitely no rug chewing socialist kind of angry guy.
Right.
He was a professor emeritus of economics at Duke University and wrote a book called Downsizing the USA. And so what Glenn didn't realize is that Dr. Naylor and I talked daily, like every day. You know, we agreed to disagree on certain policy issues, but we agreed on the right of self-determination. So after he raked Dr. Naylor over the coals, you know, Naylor calls me up and says, well, you're in for one now. And, you know, and I just laughed, you know, because especially when things progressed, you know, our message has never changed. But when Glenn announced that he was pulling up stakes and moving to Texas, I said, okay, yeah. So, you know, we shot an email to Glenn, say, hey, how would you like a do-over? Crickets. And then, you know, this has come up, crickets. And it's like, you know, look, people eventually end up in our way of thinking, and Glenn is really no different, because if he truly believes the things that he's been saying on radio and TV, this is the inevitable conclusion.
Yeah, you've been tracking with a movement we've been featuring on our channel, and so many videos I can't even count it. What we might just call a secessionist trend that's been going on all over the world, that I know you're very familiar with, particularly over the last 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. Over 35 nations have been added to the world map. You've been tracking with those trends almost as long, right? What you're about approaching your third decade here with Texas independence. With all of that, would you mind just giving us a bit of your backstory and what drew you originally to this cause, and what's kept you going on all these years? Because I got to tell you, when I tell people like, oh yeah, I'm going to interview Daniel Miller of Texit, and they've never heard of you, they're like, you know, the first thing they're like is something like, well, is he a fire and brimstone kind of guy, or, you know, something like that? I'm like, no, he's the most measured, you know, a thoughtful, you know, introspective fellow imaginable. This is not, people have really bizarre conceptions of secession. So what drew you there, and what keeps you going with this?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's the backstory is interesting, because, you know, I tell people that I wasn't born with, you know, Texit on my lips. You know, that was not it at all. I was raised by my grandparents. I was born to a single mother, raised by my grandparents, very blue collar. Dad was an iron worker for 35 years. Mom was a secretary, you know, so I had a very blue collar upbringing. But the fact of the matter is that they always stayed aware of politics. One of the things that I talk about a lot is that every evening we would sit around the dinner table, and the news would be on, and that discussion would happen around the table from the time I was small. You know, I went out, put out campaign signs with my dad. You know, we were engaged, but we were not activists, right? That wasn't
Right.
just, that was the deal. So ran for mayor of my hometown when I was 18 years old, because I believed that I could do a good job. I was wrong. I came in third. But you know, that bug never left. And I could tell you one of the moments that was really defining for me, that I think kind of set me on this path toward Texas independence, was I went to a meeting of some people that was advertised in the newspaper. And one of the things that these two brothers did was they handed me a copy of the U.S. Constitution, a copy of the Communist Manifesto. And they said, go home and read these two, and you tell us which you think the government is emulating the most in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And, you know, and then I understood after I did that. Of course, I was a Cold War kid, right? So I joke, but it's not a joke. I was so nervous to have a copy of the Communist Manifesto, I hid it under the seat of my car on the way home, right? Cold War kid, right? So, you know, it really set me on this path, right? Because we were all celebrating the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. But, you know, all of a sudden you start looking at things like restrictions on property ownership, a progressive income tax, you know, restrictions on freedom of religion. And you're looking at it, it's like, wait a minute, how did Karl Marx get a forwarding address at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? And so that was the thing that led me to. So of course that fueled it. but it was all centered around the federal aspects of this, right? I was dyed in the wool, red, white, and blue, American patriot, and that patriotism was what was driving me. And there was a frustration there because every time you thought you were making some kind of real stand for the right to keep and bear arms or freedom of religion or, you know, any of these other things, you'd get set back 10 or 12 steps. And then it was introduced to me this idea of Texas being an independent nation. And when you sit down and you initially look at it, you know, if you have an open mind and you start really understanding the intent of the founders and the framers, then you understand that we are actually quite far off of that mark. But if we believe in the words and the principles and the ideology of the founders and framers, then independence and self-government is sort of that natural progression. So, you know, there was no epiphany moment for me. You know, I didn't sit down and do the Ben Franklin close and look at pros and cons. What I did do was I said, look, all of these things that have been driving me and bothering me, that you know, this bureaucratic system in Washington, D.C. is, you know, this unfixable mess can be fixed by severing their tentacles at the borders of Texas and by us reclaiming our right of self-government. And August 24th, 1996, I crossed that proverbial line in the sand, and I've been working for independence ever since.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, back in 2010, the pollsters Scott Rasmussen and Doug Schoen published their book on data that they derived from their pretty extensive research into the Tea Party. It was entitled Mad as Hell. I don't know if you ever read it. It's a good book. I think it's on our readers list for one of the months in our Insiders Club. And they presented substantial data that showed that the country was going through a major paradigm shift, where the old political divide between left versus right or liberal versus conservative, they were dying away. And there was this new political divide that was rising. And it was a divide between the political class and the people, the rulers and the ruled. And in 2018, the British scholars Roger Ewell and Matthew Goodwin came to the exact same conclusions with regard to the Brexit referendum and the Trump campaign in 2016. They too found that the old ideological divisions of the 20th century, like you mentioned, the Cold War divisions, you know, capitalist versus communist or right versus left, Republican versus Democrat, these ideological divisions were collapsing. And a new politics surrounding identity was emerging, particularly around nation and culture and custom and tradition, all post-Cold War stuff. So in my research, I found that you said back in 2010 that you thought the Tea Party was really like a gateway to Texas nationalist concerns just flooding into the mainstream. It seems like Roger Eatwell and Matthew Goodwin, the British scholars, would confirm that assessment 8 years later. Can you give us a little insight into that? What role do you think the Tea Party movement back in 2010 has played into just the furthering of the sentiments of secession?
Oh, you're reminding me about the bleeding edge again, aren't you? I see that. Yeah. You know, look, to your point, I think before we discuss the Tea Party aspect of it, I think we need to go back to what you're talking about, because I think, you know, before that, because it gives it true context. And I think it helps people probably understand why the Tea Party is a natural gateway, or was a natural gateway for a lot of people into Texas nationalism. You know, we look around the world, and we saw at the end of World War II, there were 54 recognized countries around the world, and by the end of the 20th century, there were 192. Right. You know, those countries did not fall from space. Right. The Earth did not get any bigger. Right? Those were people just like us who said, wait a minute, we're currently being governed under a system that does not match our views, our values, our customs, whatever those things are. You know, it was interesting. John Nesbitt, in a book in 1992 or 93, I think it was, he wrote a book called Global Paradox. And his entire thesis of the book, of course, he was driven, you know, to his thesis by the telecommunications revolution, but he spotted it dead on. And he said that the world's trends point overwhelmingly toward political independence.
Mhm.
And, he cited even small countries that exist that have self-government, like Andorra. I mean, who ever heard of Andorra? But they can govern themselves how they please. So, you look at it in that context, and then you begin to understand where a lot of that sentiment comes from, with the Tea Party as a gateway. Because if you look at some of the chief complaints of the Tea Party when it was founded, well, first off, it was about a disconnected political establishment that was, where you had 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats pushing policies on people that they did not want. You had people going to the polls and voting their conscience, voting for policies that they wanted, only to have those policies overridden by the stroke of a pen by some unaccountable federal judge. So that divide was there, and that was a lot of the impetus for the Tea Party. But once you start down that road and you begin to question how you are being governed at a fundamental level, that is really sort of the initial gateway into talking about your individual state becoming a nation. And here in Texas, that was not a far jump. I mean, people talk about this all the time, where, and have for generations, ever since Texas joined the Union. So that discussion, that questioning of how we are being governed by Washington, D.C., took a real pragmatic bent, where it said, okay, wait a minute, why are we sending $103 to $160 billion extra to the federal government every single solitary year? Why should we be crushed under the weight of 180,000 pages of federal laws, rules, and regulations administered by those 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats? What would happen if we kept our money here? What would that do for the 10th largest economy in the world? Would we be number 5 or number 6? Why should we continue to take a knee to a federal government that has made such a mess of everything that they've touched, from the VA to our border to immigration to education? Everything they touch rots. So, Texans made that jump from the Tea Party to, beginning to embrace this idea of Texas being its own self-governing independent nation.
Wow. Hey, Hannah, I got to stop. I could talk to Daniel all night. I've got tons of questions here, but it's for our members. So if it's all right, can we open up the questions to them?
We have tons of questions here. And if you're just getting here, please do put your question in the Q&A box below. I'm reading through them all. There's lots. So let's get started. The first question comes from a few people. Terry, Lee, and Mark are the ones that I saw asking this. Would a newly independent Republic of Texas be prepared to fight a war against the USA, Mexico, or even China? Is there enough military reserves?
Well, Texas has its own military right now. We have our own department called the Texas Military Department. But I think the premise of that, excuse me, beyond the issue of national defense, is one where, the scenario is posited that the United States federal government will put out the call and the Air Force will come over and carpet bomb the Walmart in Houston, or something along those lines. And look, that's just not practical. One of the things I cover in my book, Texit, Why and How Texas Will Leave the Union, and we also cover on our website at tnm.me/Texit, is we really dispel that idea. This is not the 19th century. We have seen time and time again people sort of scared into fear over some replay, Civil War 2, Fight Harder, or some, we'll figure out some great sequel title for it. But the bottom line is that it's impractical. And so if we've gamed it out, we know the federal government has gamed it out. You go to a Zogby poll from 2012 or 13, where they actually polled the military, active duty military, on the issue of states having a right to leave the Union. And you find almost half of active duty service personnel who believe that states absolutely have a right to leave the Union if their voters choose to do so. And I think that's a key point here. Which is one of the reasons that our organization has been a stickler about the process. We're not talking about raising up arms and fighting another revolution. We're talking about doing what Scotland did in 2014, what the UK did shortly thereafter, and having a referendum on the issue, and then beginning the process of extracting ourselves from this political and economic union that is so dangerous to our liberties. So, there are military reasons why it's not practical. There are internal reasons in the United States where it's not practical. There are foreign policy concerns where it's not practical for them to do so. But the number one driver of that, which makes it inviable or not a viable path, is one that is purely economic. The utilization and use of military force on a population in Texas whose only crime was voting wrong will end up tanking the economy. You can't get gasoline out of bombed out refineries. So, the bottom line is it's just, I refer to it as apocalypse porn. There are a lot of people out there, particularly on the left, that continue to invoke this shadow, this specter of the previous Civil War. But the reality of it is it just is not going to happen that way.
Great. Well, then next question is from Tom. If Texit does happen, what effect will it have on the other states? Will other states follow suit? And if so, would Texas allow them to join?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think it actually dovetails pretty nicely from the previous question. Because the one thing that I did not mention that we do talk about quite often is that, there are so many states that are sympathetic to the same sort of issues that are driving and motivating Texas independence, that if the federal government were to invoke military force on a Texas population that had voted to leave, Texas might be the first to leave, but it would not be the last to leave the Union. So, it could really spin out of their control. And we all know that there's no mechanism for them to hang on to it. So, but to your point about other states, we have always encouraged every state to consider the same things that we're considering. If you look at this through the lens of pragmatism, right, the things that impact Texans, the vast majority of them that are detrimental about the federal government, also impact many other states. Texas, I mentioned a stat a moment ago where Texas overpays somewhere between $103 to $160 billion annually into the federal system. Well, we're one of about a dozen states that's true for. But you take you take that stat, the 180,000 pages of federal laws, rules, and regulations, that crushes Texans, but that crushes people in other states too. So much so that some studies show that on average, we commit 3 federal crimes every single solitary day just for, fogging a mirror on the soil of the United States. So, the fact of the matter is we think every state should be having this conversation. Here lately, we've been encouraging people that live in states that have initiative and referendum that have been calling our office, wanting to join, wanting to help out. We say, look, we want your help, but this is a conversation you also need to be having in your state. Form an organization like we did. And because you have citizen initiative, go get the petition signatures and put it on your ballot. You have a statutory mechanism that we don't have here. You can, and with your organization, put this on the ballot, force this battle between the people and the political establishment.
Well, Kelly asks a really good clarifying question. She
Okay.
wants to know, what is the process of secession? Could you articulate that for our audience?
Sure. Look, it's pretty straightforward. The one thing to bear in mind is in one way that this is very much unlike Brexit. Okay. Brexit, in the relationship between the UK and the European Union, had Article 50 of the treaty that they could invoke that would start this process. But for us, there's no clear statutory mechanism. It's absent in the Constitution. Therefore, according to the 10th Amendment, it resides to the people and to the states. So looking at the Texas Constitution, the only guidance that we have in that regard constitutionally is Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution, a post-Civil War Constitution, I might add, which ends with the words, "The perpetuity of the Union depends on the right of local self-government unimpaired to all the states." So there, for us, it sets a trigger mechanism. In Article 1, Section 2 sets out at a minimum that issues like this have to be decided by the people. You know, it says that the people have at all times the inalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their form of government in such manner as they may think expedient. So we know that it's going to culminate in a referendum, right? It will be a very similar to the 48 independence referenda that have been held around the world since 1900, where the people will go to the polls and they will ask themselves the question whether or not Texas should reassert its status as an independent nation. But you know, the vote itself is not the act, right? We always tell people Texit is not an act, it's a process. Now, once the people have expressed their political will, then we have to go into this next phase, which is transition, right? We have to begin to look at these issues where we have some things that are intertwined with the federal government that we have to contend with, like issues like Social Security, banking. I mean, there are, you know, several issues that we'll have to untangle, national debt being one of them. And then there are certain things that we're going to have to do here in Texas that, you know, while we may have the form of a national government, there are certain things by virtue of our relationship with the federal government that we do not have. The issue of currency comes to mind almost immediately, or expanding the office of the Secretary of State to handle foreign affairs, if that's what we choose to do. Those can all be handled through constitutional amendment or through statute. But, you know, those are the issues that have to happen. And then at the end of that, once the transitional plan is laid out and the transition begins, we sit down, we negotiate these particular issues, we come to terms, and then we are a self-governing independent nation state, 100% free of the federal union. Free to go negotiate our own trade deals, including a nice trade deal with the United States. I hope we could get the same deal that Mexico and Canada got. But you know, that we can behave as a nation among nations.
Well, there's a lot of questions here
Mm-hmm.
about. There are a lot of questions.
Well,
There's a
Welcome
lot
to
of
my
questions.
world, Hannah. Welcome to my world.
Yes, lots and lots. But I see a lot here about Social Security. People are
Yes.
concerned about what that would be like. Asking how would the state deal with Social Security or government funding if it secedes? Also, healthcare, particularly for the deaf community. I think we have some deaf people in our group that are wondering about that. How do you respond to Social Security concerns?
Coincidentally, the number one most asked question from me in the last 24 years. it is the most asked question. And look, it's understandable. We've been forced to take money out of our paychecks and hand it over to the federal government for them to squander and mismanage in perhaps what is the greatest Ponzi scheme ever devised in the history of mankind. But you know, let's kind of segment it out. Let's talk about how we handle different parts of the population. Okay. Those who are already receiving Social Security and other federal pension benefits, you can, according to the federal government, existing federal government policy, you can collect those while living outside of the United States. So, you know, with the exception, if you live in Cuba or North Korea, I think, or Belarus may be on the list. But the bottom line is the Social Security Administration gives actual official guidance on what to do, how to receive your Social Security payments if you live outside of the United States. Okay. So, you know, for folks that are concerned about, you know, receiving their money, that's not going to be an issue. To the point, though, because some people believe that, well, the federal government will exact terrible retribution on us. When I mentioned that stat earlier, that we overpay between 103 to 160 billion dollars into the federal system every year, you know, that's money that we overpay, right? We as Texas taxpayers pay that to the federal system and never see it again. You know, we equate it to going to a doctor who draws all your blood out, spills 40% of it on the floor, then begins a transfusion for the remainder, and then tells you wouldn't be alive without him, right? That's the way the federal government is when it comes to Texas revenue. So with all of that revenue being right here in Texas, total Social Security payments in Texas, I think were about 74 billion last year. So last I checked, 74 billion is far less than 160 billion. So if the federal government decided to not pay any of the retirees at all, Texas has it covered. So that's not going to be an issue. Now, the other aspect of that is, what about people that have been paying into the system? Okay. Typically, what happens is nations negotiate between one another what are called totalization agreements, so that, let's say that I go work overseas and I earn credits in their equivalent social security system, and then I come to, say, the United States and I work. Well, what it does with those social security or those social security totalization agreements is it ensures that you don't lose credit for your working time in paying into those pension systems like that. So, for that to happen, though, Texas would need to develop its own social security system. Now, the good thing about this is that we would have the ability to determine whether we wanted a mandatory system or an opt-in system. I'm pretty sure Texans are going to want an opt-in system, and not a mandatory system. But the beautiful part is that for many years now, Texas has had a shining example of what an alternative to federal Social Security is. Down in Galveston County, you hear it called the Galveston Plan all the time, where the county of Galveston and I think the two around it, Brazoria and Fort Bend County, opted out of Social Security and into their own retirement system for the employees there. And what's been amazing about it is there's been a phenomenal track record for what's called the Galveston Plan, where performance in that system has outpaced Social Security by a massive amount, including stability. They're not having to rob from general revenue to pay into the pension, nor are they robbing out of the pension to pay for general revenue shortfalls. So, nor is it a Ponzi scheme. It is an investment plan. So we already have phenomenal examples of how we can do it without the federal government here in Texas. It's just a matter, once we regain our right of self-government, then we address those issues. Current retirees continue to get paid. If the federal government welches on the deal, then we can take care of it. For those that have been paying in, we can negotiate totalization agreements because the United States has them for so many people. And then in the meantime, we develop our own system, our own plan, probably an expansion, an opt-in expansion of the Galveston Plan for every citizen.
We have a few people here, Michael, David, and Envy, who want to know what would the timeline for secession look like. And Michael adds, I'm looking at possibly moving to Texas. How long would I have to get in?
You better get here before you need a visa. That's all I'm going to say. It's good questions. The fact of the matter is that the timeline, I was asked at a rally many years ago on the Capitol grounds. Someone came up to me and said, they said, Daniel, how long is this going to take? I said, it's going to take as long as you let it take. But there are definite milestones that you hit. For me, it's been, a 25-year journey almost in August of this coming year. But it's going to take as long as we let it take, but the milestones are important, right? That one of the major ones happened this week when a state representative actually filed the legislation that would give Texans the vote on it. Now, will it pass the legislature? Who knows? But the horse is out of the barn now. The fact of the matter is that any politician in Austin that is seen as standing between the people and their ability to vote on this issue probably is not going to survive the next election cycle. So the horse is out of the barn. We are going to get a vote on this sooner rather than later. Now, if we get Representative Biedermann's bill across the finish line in this session, it specifies a date in November of this year that Texans would go to the polls and vote. Now, that date, people ask, why not sooner? It's really a couple of things. Number one is it's the next uniform general election date for Texas. It's when we would go to the polls and vote on constitutional amendments. So, that's it. So it makes the bill revenue neutral. And then the other part of it is we can't force the governor to call a special session by virtue of a bill. He has discretion under the Texas Constitution as to when he does and does not do that. So, there are a lot of reasons why that is. But look, there's no one either on this broadcast right now or in Texas that wants it to happen any sooner than I do. But the one thing that we have to bear in mind is that it is a process. We have to follow the steps. and we have to keep it between the ditches, because the thing that you do not want to do is run this thing into the ditch because you don't get the process right. Because when you do that, you've lost your opportunity for this for one or more generations. So, you measure twice and you cut once.
Wow, what an interview. And there's just so much more. If you want to hear more of this Q&A, as well as actually becoming a live participant and asking your very own questions to the movers and shakers of the conservative movement all over the world, then you need to join our Insiders Club by simply clicking on the link below. Every week, you're going to have special access to some of your favorite conservatives across the globe, and you're going to love interacting daily with thousands of your fellow conservatives on our group chat and posting platforms. So make sure to click on that link below and join our Insiders Club and get your backstage pass to the worldwide conservative movement today.